Hello.
Well, hello there, and hello to everybody else who's listening. You are listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman, and I am joined by my co-host, Jamie Almanzán. And we typically start with a question, although actually I'd like you to ask me a question, something that comes to mind when I explain this to you. So our guest today, Melissa Sonnek, she and I were sort of geeking out or admiring the Man in the Arena speech. I think it's Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is credited with it. Brené Brown really made it known throughout the nation and the world because she uses it in her book, Daring Greatly. And I love the story of the Man in the Arena because, or the speech, the Man in the Arena, because it really challenges those, well, first of all, for the leader to give themselves permission to say, hey, look, I'm the one who's in the arena. I'm the one who's getting knocked down. And to sort of point to the person in the nosebleeds to get over it or to quit throwing stones. But at the same time, when you're a leader, you feel like you're just, all you're doing is being told that sometimes you just feel like a piece of shit because everybody's telling you what you're not doing well. And that gets really hard for a superintendent. So, okay, what question comes to mind for you after hearing that?
My question would be, do you believe this simple question? This is an overtly simple question. I mean, this is where my brain is going, but
yeah.
In essence, do you believe you're a good leader? Do you believe that this is something you want to do, that you can learn how to do better, that you want to improve at?
Right.
Basically, it comes down to do you have the confidence in yourself? Because the more confidence I have in myself.
I like that better because the other piece seems to suggest the fragility piece to be able to then say, but I'm a good person. Why are they so mad at me? And I like that piece of, do you have the confidence to do the right thing even when those folks up in the nosebleeds who don't have all the information have generated an opinion about you and the work?
Can I, this makes me think of a different, so basically, we've talked about this as the John Lewis idea, it's good trouble. The phrase good trouble is the good part isn't really the thing you should focus on. You should focus on the trouble part because the trouble part is really what the work is. The good part just makes you feel good about yourself. The trouble part is the work. And if you are prepared for the trouble part, meaning emotionally prepared, then there's skills related to it, then it's a lot easier. My biggest learning as I turn the corner, right? As I'm turning middle age towards 60 is this: make them say no. Meaning, don't say no to something you believe in or that you think you should do or try or ask for, whatever. Better to have someone outside say, no, we're not taking that. You're fired, than to fire yourself. And so ever since I started, and the first time I did this was when I went to rent an apartment. And I started saying, I love your house, but I won't pay what you're asking. Will you give it to us for this amount? Here's our background. Here's our family. Here's my children. Here's my job. And I made them say no to me. And 3 out of 4 times they did. But all I needed was one. And I got the house that I wanted for less because they didn't have someone, and just like that. And now it keeps repeating over and over and over and over and over in multiple places. Make them say no. Force them to say no to you. What makes superintendents afraid to make them say no? Why are you so nervous about losing your job? Is it just the money? Is it because superintendents made more? What? Because I could get you a principalship like that instantaneously.
Right. No, I will say, particularly if you have a family and you're not in a metropolitan area where you could potentially get a job in another district that's neighboring, you're uprooting your family, potentially their connections and their friendships and their affiliations and associations and all of that. And to some extent, you feel like a failure. So I could imagine that you are afraid to push to the point of getting a no because you worry that no also now comes with a non-renewal, that they're not going to renew your contract. I think part of it is ego, part of it is loss of power, part of it is having to explain to a interview panel why you're looking for a new job, those types of things. I can imagine.
I think that's all helpful perspective.
They like the power. Look at why you have 98-year-old senators. And how on earth how could they be my representative?
Isn't it
How is
fascinating?
it possible that they understand what life is like for someone in their 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, teenagers today? How on earth are they making good decisions for the future when it's about power and influence? And to some extent, affluence, when you said the amount that superintendents get paid, they get paid 5 times, 6 times the salary of a teacher, which in so many ways is absurd. Teachers should make just as much. I'm not saying superintendents should make less.
I'm up for that plan. Let's do that.
Right?
One of my favorite parts of the entire podcast, obviously, as we're talking about power and ego, was both of you having a Jamie Post-it.
Wait. Okay, so sorry. I know that you heard us just gabbing about Post-it notes, right? The Post-it notes. And I'm curious. First of all, tell me about the Post-it notes from your perspective. And then secondly, what do you wish every leader in America had on a Post-it note right at their computer?
I should imagine if that could be true. So I loved the reflection.
And don't blow it. Don't make it, what are you looking at? You're like, oh.
That's one of my favorite parts of the fact that you both had a Post-it note from Jamie. And it showed the difference between, in some ways, relationship between Melissa and you. Melissa's Post-it is what I would have put in front of every leader. I mean, if I could put the main one, it's like, listen better, listen to people, prioritize people. That would be the Post-it note. But hers is, to make it simple, it's ask better questions. Because if you ask better questions, you get better answers from people. And that is what creates this opportunity to understand how they think and what they care about and all that stuff. So hers is ask better questions. Yours is, why didn't you? Why didn't you? It felt so much like a friendship and a colleague where I'm like, why didn't you do this? What the hell? We're so disappointed in you. Once again.
You know what? I didn't take it that way. I liked it. It's about digging a little deeper. I liked it. It
made me so happy that the two of you talked about it that way. And I feel so grateful that Melissa considers it helpful and that you consider it helpful. And I just love the difference between the two questions. It made me very happy.
That's so cool. All right. How about this? Let's see if I do a pretty good job of listening to Melissa Sonnek. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question because I know you are. Empath Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with Empath Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. Empath Speech, EMPAT speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools. Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guest is Melissa Sonnek, the Associate Superintendent of the Roseville Area Schools in Roseville, Minnesota. Melissa, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Hey, Peter. Thank you so much for having me.
It is such an honor to meet you. And when I first learned about you, I did like a little cursory search, and I found this really incredibly powerful and really compassionate call to courage. You had asked anyone who might be interacting with the video to live into their values. And first of all, you mentioned my friend and co-host Jamie Almanzán and his work with the Roseville Schools. And so that obviously warmed my heart. But then you stressed really this importance of living one's values, not just professing them. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit. I know we're just jumping right into it. It's like, hey, welcome to the podcast. Can we talk about something really heavy? So sorry about that. But would you mind talking a little bit about what compelled you to create the video? And if it's all right, I'll put a link in the show notes. And then the actions that you took to live your value of courage.
Yes, of course. So when you first mentioned that, I was really curious. I'm like, what video is he referring to? And then I realized it was a part of a weekly series that I started doing in March of 2020. So think about where we were as a world. We were wiping down our groceries, like social distancing by 6 feet, and none of us had any experience with this. And I remember getting this video from my daughter's third grade teacher. And in the video, she was wobbly and trying hard to be brave and tell the kids that it was going to be okay and that we're going to get through this together, and talk to them about how distance learning was going to look. And I watched it and I just remember thinking like, oh, that right there, like that is the heart of a teacher. And I also felt like we're going to need to walk the walk. And if we take care of the teachers, then the teachers will be able to take care of our kids. And so I proposed this idea to our superintendent and the superintendent's cabinet at the time that we create content, like weekly videos that were around like social and emotional support for our educators, right? So that's what inspired the video. And the second part of your question then was really around like, all right, then what actions do we take to live into our values of courage? And I really thought about that. And in my current role, really, it's a lot of having hard conversations with different stakeholders. And so I see our stakeholders as our students, our families, our staff, our community, our board, our administrators, right? All people that I love and care about. And when having those conversations, it's really important to me that our BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color administrators really feel supported by me. And so my standing offer to them is to stand behind them, beside them, or in front of them when it comes to the racial harm that they experience. So I'll tell a story as an example. I remember a few years back having a conversation, and it was with a white mom. And she was talking about the principal at the school who identified as a Black man. And she used the word in describing him, she used the word dangerous. And it made me go like, oh, like, what do we mean by dangerous? And it makes me think about Bettina Love's story of like, you got to put your hand on the pole, right? Like, and so that's kind of my call to action to myself to live into courage, because I could have a comfortable conversation with the mom, or I could push back and challenge it. And I did, and said, I see it really different. And one of the things that you mentioned, Jamie Almanzán, and he's an equity coach that I've worked with for a few years now. I have a Post-it that sits on my desk that says, ask better questions. Right. And so I was
That's amazing. I also have a Jamie Post-it, but it's why didn't you? Because I'll always say, well, why didn't you? Why did you? So it's like, that's amazing. We have our Post-its. Yep.
Right. That is so great. So I was asking some questions and I was like, help me understand, like, what would be dangerous about that? And then I think the mom responded something along the lines of, it's a really hard time in America to be raising white boys. And I said, as a mother of four boys, I see it really differently. And here's why. And so one, it's having the courage to have those hard conversations, right? Ask hard questions. But then it was also an offer to the principal. And here's where I think we have to be really careful, because as a white woman, I could very much say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And that actually might be a miss. And so it's asking that principal what the support would look like for him that he would want. And so I made some offers like, hey, I can work with this parent in the future so you don't have to, or we can have one of your associate principals work with her. And he said, no, like that would actually feel disempowering and maybe even what the parent wants. So instead, just support me. So I think it's really important that we offer choice as we're navigating this too.
You know, I'm thinking also because one of the videos I saw, and I would say that your voice was a little bit shaky in this moment, because here you were confronting a community, or at least confronting the emotion of Philandra Castile's death in your community. So I can remember Michael Brown's murder and its impact on Columbia, Missouri, where I was superintendent. Ferguson was 2 hours away. However, the impact, absolutely, there was a ripple effect that came all the way to the university, where there were encampments and protests, and we were trying to navigate and student walkouts and things like that, and absolutely trying to support while also providing a safe space for children and adults. And so it resonated for me as you were having what no doubt was a difficult conversation one way to your community, and hoping that they were going to do some appropriate reflection about the role that they could play and the support they can provide to a community that has been historically and continues to be oppressed by a system.
Yes, absolutely. And you referenced Philandra Castile, and that was in 2016. And that actually took place in our school district in Falcon Heights.
That's right. That's what I remember seeing you say. I mean, it was almost immediately after your...
Then it was in
Yes, I'm
addition to
sorry.
that, because it was 2020 with George Floyd.
That's right. That's right.
happened
That's right.
then.
My apologies. That's right. Yeah.
But both were completely emotional experiences. Mm-hmm.
If you're just joining us, our guest today is Melissa Sonnek, the Associate Superintendent of the Roseville Area School District. Now, Roseville is a district of 7,000 plus students. It represents 7 municipalities. It's 62% students of color. And you wrote to me that the district's diversity is its strength. You also said, I won't consider myself an effective educator until no identity marker predicts achievement. I know you personally and your district as a whole has worked really closely to identify systems of oppression. And would you tell us a little bit more about that link between identity and achievement?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, because I believe currently in the United States, across school districts, there are identity markers that predict achievement. Race, free and reduced price lunch status, multilingual learners, we can go on. And I really want to live in a world where no identity marker predicts someone's achievement. I also believe that we don't experience the world as it is. We experience the world as we are. And part of why I am so passionate about this is due to my own experience as a high school student. So I'm going to get personal and a little vulnerable, but I'm going to tell a story that kind of illustrates that. So I was a young mom. I had twins my senior year of high school in September. And prior to that, I was a student with good grades. I was college bound. I was on the student council, captain of the cheerleading squad. Like, my school had high expectations for me. And there's this defining moment where I was like, oh, like, this isn't how it is for everyone. And I'll never forget it. I was in my high school guidance counselor's office, and I was ahead of my credits. So I was going to take off try 1, and we were trying to figure out a plan for trimester 2 and 3. And she was really trying to push me to like some alternative education. And I want to be clear, ALCs 20, 30 years ago were not at all what they are today. And I remember saying to her, but how would that look on a college application? And she looked over at me, like over the top of her glasses, and said, college, how do you plan on doing that? And I can put words to it as an adult that maybe my 18-year-old self couldn't.
Right.
But I remember at that moment thinking like, oh, like, nobody is going to define me but me. And nobody is going to take away from my kids the opportunity to live the life that they deserve. So it almost inspired me, but it was also a super emotional experience. And what she maybe knew that I didn't is only a third of young moms graduate from high school, and only about 2% go on to college.
However, you wished in that moment she would have had the mindset of listening to someone say, so how does this impact my college application, to say, oh, this statistic doesn't apply here, that her identity is not going to define her achievement.
You got it.
Yeah.
You got it. And I stood up and I said 2 words, and maybe not the sassy 2 words my 18-year-old self wanted to say. And I said, watch me. And I graduated. I did my bachelor's in 3 years, my master's in 11 months. I became a college professor at 28 and a principal at 35. And honestly, like, it did like kind of inspire me. But at the same time, I think that was like the moment where I became forever intertwined with my commitment to equity, because I know what low expectations feels like. And I know what having to, statistically speaking, beat the odds feels like. And so students in our schools who are in that same position, they're my mirror. These are the kids that I love most. And for me, education changed my stars. And I believe it's our responsibility as educators for all of our students, right? So that no identity marker predicts achievement.
I love it. So this will maybe encourage you in that I recently was attending a board meeting, and a student came up to the podium to address the board and said, and this student I would imagine identified as white, and said, I'm at this high achieving high school. I really worked hard to get into advanced placement courses. I look around the room, I don't see any students of color. And when I start to ask my friends, why is it that you don't take these courses? It's exactly the low expectation that he perceived that they are hearing about how difficult the class might be, or how expensive certain materials are, or how expensive the AP exam itself is. And he said, we have such an opportunity to leverage. I mean, 18-year-old, 17-year-old such wisdom, and it gave me such hope potentially that maybe that there's a better future for us, in that there's a shifting, or at least this individual was encouraging us to shift our mindset around who is eligible and should be in advanced or honors classes. And so at any rate, I'm hopeful that school district will think really critically, maybe vulnerably, about how they are telling kids about their coursework. So anyway.
Right on.
Yeah.
You could learn a lot from kids when we stop to listen.
You know what? So when I was superintendent, we just tossed around the idea back and forth around start times. And it wasn't until students came forward and said, all the science is there. What are we doing?
Yep.
Stop talking about it. Do it. Yeah. Yeah. We really could learn a lot from following their lead. I'd like to ask you a question I ask of every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
I think for me, it feels like grace. And I think we sometimes don't always give ourselves that as educators, as adults, as leaders. And one of the things that I often say is it's a problem to be solved and not a test of who we are as people. There's a sign also in my office. It's the Teddy Roosevelt, like man in the arena quote.
Yes. Brene Brown brought that forward to me, right? I mean, of course, right? It really helped me think through, my God, the critics. Yeah.
Right. And the other part of that quote that I love is, if you link it to education, like it's not if there will be face down moments in the arena, it's just when. And it's having more than one chance to get things right. It's standing up and dusting ourselves off and going back in again and again and again. And as an associate superintendent, it's also modeling that for principals and administrators in our district as well. It's okay to not be perfect, right? Like, in fact, none of us are. But when we fall short, we learn from it and do better, right? It's the whole like know better, do better.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of an Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. Our guest today is Melissa Sonnek, the Associate Superintendent of the Roseville Area School District. And Melissa, before we go to this next section, I just want to say, you were so incredibly vulnerable in our last segment. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story about your high school year. I think I buzzed right past it. And I really want to say that it takes so much courage to tell one story, because I think it helps others who are experiencing having that as their own experience to know that it's appropriate and it's okay to talk about it in a way that will help others grow. So thank you. I really appreciate it. Now, in this segment, we do some additional reflection. And so, like we do every week, I ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. So, Melissa, what happened?
Right. So what I would like to talk about is our goal to recruit, hire, and retain BIPOC educators. In Roseville, our mission is innovation, excellence, and equity in all we do. And I think as an organization, we really believe that representation matters. Like, our kids deserve mirrors of themselves in educators and leaders. But beyond that, our white students also need to see BIPOC leaders. And I use the acronym, but it's Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And the reason that they need that as well is so that they can see beyond possible stereotypes and biases, right? Like, we want all of our students to be able to build relationships across differences. That's the world that we're sending them off into. And since I've been in this role, I've hired several principals. 2 of them have been BIPOC principals, and I have their consent to share part of their stories. And in preparing for today, I connected with them, and I have some of their perspectives in their own worlds that I hope to share as well. I'll refer to them just as Principal 1 and Principal 2. So Principal 1 is a third-year elementary principal that we have retained. He identifies as Latino. Principal 2 is also a BIPOC principal who we were not able to retain, and she identifies as South Asian or Bangladesh.
Okay. So here you are as living your values. You are looking to recruit and retain leaders of color, BIPOC leaders. And for every obvious reason, well, maybe it's not so obvious for some, right? As you identified just a moment ago, it's incredibly important for a number of reasons. One, for children of color to see leaders who look like them, and then also to dispute and distinguish or extinguish the ideas that children may often only see food services custodians and have an image in their mind of who is a leader and who is not a leader. And so being able to really dismantle one's mindset around also leadership. And so one leader you were able to retain, one leader, it sounds like you were not. What would you say was overlooked in that process?
Well, I think what I'd like to do to answer that question is start with how we support new principals in general, right?
Yeah.
So we have an extensive onboarding process. We spend about 3 half days in the summer with new principals. And then we meet with principals once a month across the school year. And it's all around the lens of support. And it's everything from how to call in sick, right? Like to what does your school improvement plan look like? And we try to do everything in Roseville through the lens of like equity in all we do, right? How do we really cultivate equity-minded leadership in our schools? So that's our overall onboarding system. Then new principals are also given a mentor. So they have a practicing principal in the district, and they have monthly agendas that they meet around to. And part of my guidance in that is, hey, we want this to be whatever you need it to be. So this is meant to be a guide, but feel free to go whatever direction you need to go to help you be successful as a new principal in our system. Then we also do one-on-one check-ins. So they have check-ins with myself and the Associate Superintendent of Equity and Innovation, and we meet with them every 6 weeks on opposite schedules. You could stand back and look at that and say like, all right, that's a pretty robust support system. And there are some things that we overlooked, right?
Yeah.
So one,
in terms of your mentor?
Well, there's a lot of them. Like one, we give all the same support to first year principals. And as I think about that, I'm like, whoa. Your veteran principal who's coming to us from a different organization does not need the same supports as what I call it. And I say this respectfully because I was also a baby principal at one point in my career. But a baby principal needs a lot more support than someone who's a 10-year veteran.
Sure. And also, if you look at like Jean Twenge's work on generations, there's actually a generational difference in terms of how one approaches work, how one approaches relationships, what they need from those relationships. And that's without even any of the layers of identity. And so if you're now recruiting a BIPOC leader and you're hoping to retain and you're assigning a white educator who's been doing it for 25 years, they may have some knowledge that in terms of navigating the system, and they may be missing some really important pieces as well.
Yep, you got it. I also have learned.
I'm only speaking to the things that I've also learned. Sorry, this is like my own therapy session in terms of recruiting individuals and then seeing them leave and then saying, my God, and then everyone's saying, we're not doing enough to recruit. I'm like, we're recruiting. We're just not retaining.
Oh, can I also say that people don't always see what happens behind the scenes in terms of recruitment?
Of
what
course.
they see is who's hired and who's retained and who's not. So there can be a Herculean effort behind the scenes. I can think of one situation where we had interviews lined up, and I believe I had 4 BIPOC candidates. One of them was offered a job. I was like, I can't fault that. Another one decided it just wasn't a good fit where they were at right there, like in their life. They were an AP and just weren't really ready to transition to the principalship. But I lost 3 of the 4 candidates within days of the interview. And so I don't say that with judgment. It's just the context and the reality. Right? So we're measured by the action and what takes place. We don't always see all the effort that goes behind the scenes in terms of recruitment.
Yeah. That's intriguing. And now tell me, where's Roseville located?
We'd be considered a first ring suburb. So we're right on the edge of St. Paul.
For us, we were 2 hours from St. Louis, 2 hours from Kansas City. We were a large town, and there's about 150,000 people or a little bit less. And so when you start looking at, is there an established middle class, particularly if we were recruiting an African-American leader? Not really. And then everything from where will I get my haircut? Where will I go to church? Where will I eat? It became a real challenge in terms of the Herculean effort one has in the background going, and we can provide this kind of service and this kind of support and this. And in the end, I think I'm going to go to Kansas City or Chicago because that's really where I feel like I may have community, as opposed to being the trailblazer you were asking me to be.
Yeah. I also think that you can have a system of people who have egalitarian beliefs and values and still create inequitable outcomes.
Ooh, what do you mean by that?
I mean, what we value, right? Like one of the things I talked about in Roseville, part of our strategic plan is to recruit, hire, and retain BIPOC educators. And we all are, they think of racism like, so I heard the analogy once that racism is like smog, and we've all breathed it in, right? So between the books we've read, the movies we've seen, schools, curriculum, right? Like all of our experiences. And so I deeply value racial equity, but that doesn't mean that I am absolved of causing racial harm. So it's seeing that disconnect sometimes between our beliefs and our behaviors, and how there can be a gap in there that makes the principalship not sustainable for our BIPOC leaders.
Yeah. Okay. So you provided all of these different supports, and then I interrupted you. So I think we're getting towards what got overlooked, because you appropriately said, okay, before we talk about that, let's actually talk about what does support look like.
So I want to talk about specifically what got overlooked. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, what do we need to do differently to support the additional bandwidth that it takes to be a leader of color in our system? And to answer this, I'd like to share more in the words of our principals. So Principal 1 that I spoke to around his experience says, I felt that I was hired as my linguistic and cultural background mirrors the growing student population in my building. However, I also felt that I was put within the BIPOC umbrella, where it felt like only one voice and experience within that group gets the attention. And I, as Latino, did not fit into that experience. The way I conduct myself in my own background is different from the white-black racial binary, and that was part of what was overlooked. While standing in solidarity with other racial groups, I felt my own experience was not a part of the conversation or taken into consideration. A particular example, and I'm going to cite this example because I'm going to come back to it a couple times, for him was the process of advocating for an associate principal, because it was what the community, the students, and myself needed, but it was how that process felt that got overlooked. Okay. And I also spoke with principal number 2, and which she shared with me just blew my mind. She said there was not an exit interview when departing from employment, and it did not resemble the care I received during employment or even post-employment as a community member. While one-on-one relationships took care and leaned in, and she cites her relationship with the superintendent, myself, principal colleagues, those who would do an exit interview passed by the step, and she wasn't sure why. And she said, I don't feel harmed in it. Rather, it just didn't seem to meet the retainment goals if folks aren't formally trying to understand why they didn't retain.
Wow, that is pretty powerful. I think sometimes we don't do, I can't explain why we don't do exit interviews, other than maybe we don't want to know what they are feeling, and that's maybe unintentional. We don't realize that's what we're doing. They left, so I guess we wish them well, as opposed to what could we have learned from this process.
And we put a system in place now in our HR department. So I was like, I need to look into that. And can we just offer her an exit interview? Part of the feedback I got was, after 30 days, we lose some of the relativeness, because it's so, if it's a year away, it's harder to remember it and put it into context. And I was like, but let's still offer it.
Right.
Have it in place now. And I think it was still a complete miss that we didn't.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of this because it sounds like you're very much a systems thinker, and it's, how are we going to recruit leaders of color if we haven't also supported our educators, the teacher leaders, and how will we then recruit even within to become first-year teachers, and then those teacher leaders, and then become assistant principals and principals? And so if we have people leaving the district, and that's, we should be doing that for everybody, why are you leaving kind of thing. And if that will help inform your ultimate goal of you want your superintendent to be a superintendent of color, right? Who maybe grew up in your system, a grow your own kind of thing. So it's not just in some cases, communities that do a Hail Mary, and then there's just maybe not a fit. And I hate using that term because it's like, what does that mean? But for an individual who's moving their entire family to a community and then says, you know what, this is maybe not what I want, and they move to another system, we lose great people. So how do you do this in a way that grows your own? Anyway, okay. So that's interesting in terms of what got overlooked. And that actually speaks into relationships. So I'm curious, what did you learn about relationships and what new relationships were formed?
I really strive to be a relational leader. So I appreciated
I get that sense.
I appreciated this critical self-reflection around relationships. And I think what I learned is that I can be in relationship with a BIPOC principal as their direct supervisor with high levels of trust and support and love, and relationship is not enough. Like, it goes back to the Bettina Love, like, how do I put my hand on the pole? Meaning, like, how do I interrupt racial harm personally? We have two really important goals for our principals in Roseville Area Schools. One is to be an instructional leader. Two is to interrupt inequities. And so for me, one of the things that happened this year actually is we had a staff meeting at a site that I was a part of. And after the staff meeting, one of the teachers reached out. And it was to me and our superintendent, both white women, and this was a white woman reaching out. And it was really interesting. Like, the theme in her email was not safe. And there was, like, around the edges, I could just see this like white fragility. And usually when I'm working with teachers, I don't take principals out of the conversation. And part of the reasoning behind that is we can't take people out of the conversation who are a part of the solution. And sometimes it's appropriate. And so I did in this case, but I had a conversation with the principal first saying, hey, I want to use my own like whiteness and my own experiences with white fragility to do some equity coaching. Are you comfortable if I meet with this teacher and if I do it without you? And they were like, yeah, absolutely. And what I've learned about coaching for equity is that you can't swing equity like a bat. I also find that you can't just say things like, have you read White Fragility? Because it puts people on the defensive, especially if they have strong values around racial equity. A lot of people come to Roseville for that reason. Like, I want to work in a system that values equity. And so I met with the teacher. I do a lot of storytelling. I do a lot of asking questions. And one of the things that came out of that conversation that was a little bit more vulnerable and a little bit more of a theme was like, the staff member didn't feel important. They didn't feel like, I don't feel like they love me the same way that they love my Latino colleagues. And I remember having experiences like that as a white woman. I remember getting on a Zoom, I don't know, 4 years or 5 years ago or so, and it was facilitated by a Black leader. And when my Black colleagues would get on, they all had nicknames. It was like, hey, Schmitty, hey, Cray K. And I got on and it was like, hey, Melissa. And I was like, I'm never going to get a nickname. We all want to belong. We all want to be seen and valued. And so I shared that with the principal, and it really resonated with him. It softened, and he took this stance of like compassion, like, oh, like, I don't want her to feel that way either. We don't want to alienate our white allies in this work. And a colleague of color once said to me, if people of color could eliminate racism, look, we would have done it. We need white allies in this work, so we can't alienate those allies. But we also have to be thoughtful of our BIPOC leaders carrying this extra bandwidth of trying to interrupt racial harm while at the same time experience racial harm. So for me, I have to engage more personally and individually, like one conversation at a time.
What really resonated for me when you were talking about a relationship is how we can do this important work about understanding our own identities, how we were socialized, dismantling in our own minds the bias that exists, right? If you have a brain, you have bias. And so really questioning the things that pop into our heads and refuting them and working hard. We cannot do all of that for an entire organization. And so we can provide that support. And yet I guess what I'm getting at is, how do you help build that relationship so that it begins to permeate the cultural field that is your school district, right? So that when you do recruit, because part of the recruitment is they see you and they see you as an ally, and then you're not alongside all day, every day, nor does someone want you there. They do have an expectation, though, that they're going to have a relationship within their own system. And so I'm curious, how does that work? How does that work look, or what does that look like in your own school district?
I think you're asking a really important question. Because I think the message to our BIPOC leaders cannot be, hey, we're going to continue to be a really racist, oppressive system, and we just want you to be more resilient in it. Instead, you're saying, like, how do we change the culture? So it's not that we're interrupting racial harm or inequities, we're preventing them from happening in the first place.
The interruption is when you hear someone say, well, I feel unsafe, or I'm not safe, or that person is dangerous, or even what is perceived as a compliment. Oh, that individual is so articulate. And you want to disrupt, right? Disrupt, like, So, and at the same time, you want to then stop pulling people, as Desmond Tutu said, stop pulling people out of the river and go to the headwaters and find why they keep falling in. So we're never going to get to this point where people are talking about unsafe and dangerous and articulate and all those kinds of things, because we've done some of this important work on the front end. And it sounds like you have to do both. And so I'm curious, what does that look like in the form of relationship building? And maybe relationship isn't the right term, but it seems like it's that empathy, compassion through relationship that begins to shift the minds and hearts of people.
Yeah, I think it's about learning, actually. Right? We can have, one of the things I said earlier is we can have these values and there's a gap between our values and our behaviors, right? So for example, one of the things that I found to be helpful, especially for folks who look like me, white folks, is work around bias, like learning about blind spots and how we all have them and how our brains want to take information and put it into boxes or categories. And so understanding how our brains work, I feel like this is something we can learn our way out of. Relationship is a part of it too, though.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, it's almost like when you hear a teacher say, I just love these kids. I go, I want you to love them. I also want you to teach them.
Yep.
So, yeah. So there's the affective piece, and then there's the actual doing of the work, and you do that by learning. So what frustrated you?
Yeah. Before I get to what frustrated me, I want to share a little bit of principal voice, if that's okay.
You bet.
So I asked our principals, what did they learn about relationships from this? And principal one said, I have learned, and this is really beautiful, that there are more allies than I had imagined. And that has allowed me to open up and be more comfortable with showing up as my authentic self at meetings, schools, for my kids and for my families. Principal 2 said her learning was about her authentic relationships with direct supervisors. She said, during my principalship, the SOUP and ASOUP were attentive, adaptable, and humble in coaching. She also went on to say relationships with directors of color allowed some affinity to occur within the district. So I think affinity is important. But she went on to say the power differential was more notable in asking for help than expected. And she said the relationships were the retained element. And employment did not, but the relationships were retained. And so I learned that the process systems are not overcome by relationships alone. And I think that's I think there's really 2 key takeaways in that. One, that relationships aren't going to solve problems in the bigger system, right? So we have to be systems thinkers. I think 2, understanding that we can cause harm along our identity markers. So for example, I can operate in ways that oppress women, even though I identify as a woman. Right? So as leaders of color, we can operate in ways that cause racial harm. I don't think either of those things would be intentionally, but we're not absolved from it based on our identity markers.
Yeah. It's also how we've been socialized. So to use your example of being a woman in a cabinet meeting, that you may be the only woman and you're silent, or you apologize just like I'm sorry. And it's like, you would never see your male counterparts doing something that's like that, or that something that's important to you, you may feel as you look around the room that it may not be important to others, so you don't speak up. Or you have a great idea, you've just said it, and then your male counterpart says the same idea, and then everyone goes, great idea, because you've been silenced for so long. And that's because the system that's the cultural field that exists. And so that calls for a disruption, not just a learning.
Right. Here's what's a nod to Roseville. So I've been on the cabinet for, probably like 6 years or so. But for the last 4 years, when new administration came in, and I started as the ASOUP at that time as well, I looked around the room and it's all women on our cabinet, except for 2 members.
That is a nod and kudos to a school district. Rachel White, who does a lot of work, and now she was in Knoxville, but now at the University of Tennessee. Now she's at the University of Texas, Austin. She runs the superintendent lab, and she collects a lot of data around superintendents. In particular, what happens when a woman who's been in leadership exits. They often replace them with a white male. So it'll be interesting how Roseville continues to support and cultivate and curate a system or a field that says the women who are in leadership right now, that this is part of our succession plan. So here's hoping. Yeah.
Here's a Minnesota stat for you. When I finished my superintendent exit panel, there was a seasoned, respected superintendent in the panel. And she said, Melissa, in the state of Minnesota, 82% of our teachers are women and 17% of our superintendents are women.
Yep.
Interesting gap.
Yeah, I think that's even lower than the rest of the nation. Wow. What frustrated you?
I think the thing that was the most frustrating is things that happened outside my sphere of influence. Like I have this balcony perspective in Roseville Area Schools, but there's all these moves on the dance floor that just feel a little bit further outside my sphere of influence. And I think it goes back to something that I mentioned earlier. I have to engage, not with words and not through relationship, but action. And I need to take on some of those hard conversations so they're not left to our BIPOC principals alone. And I'll share some responses from our principals too, because I asked the principals, what frustrated you? And principal one said, the process of advocating for an associate principal was the hardest because there were personal attacks, or what I felt were personal attacks, that made me really question whether this was the place or the role for me. And when those questions came from fellow BIPOC leaders, it was the most challenging to reconcile and move forward. Principal two said, and this one breaks my heart to read, teachers and staff entrenched in whiteness and power. That was on me as an administrator of color to interrupt, coach, or partnering with a white leader for certain things is meaningful and could have been repeated more.
What professionals in other fields don't understand is, particularly when you talk about discipline, when you are disciplining an individual and that individual then gets to tell their narrative throughout the entire school, the building, the system, and you have very little recourse in terms of what you can say, particularly if you're moving to non-renew. And everybody knows that person as, we love going and scrapbooking and we go tailgate and we do all these wonderful things with that family. And I can't believe that the district is treating her this way, particularly if it's a leader of color and it can't be this person's problem. There's always been no problem beforehand. So it's got to be this leader's problem. And so you said something at the end there about partnering with a white leader to do that work together. I think that probably does a level of protection as well as a level of support and credibility for the rest of the system, potentially, to say, this may not be the leader, but rather there are things that we don't know that are impacting children. And boy, they're standing up for kids in this sense.
Yes, absolutely. You described that perfectly. And I have lived some of that, right? Like I remember non-renewing someone, and I was strategic about the non-renewal. And I'm a white woman, right? So like I carried an emotional from this.
Any one of us who've been principals, right? We're thinking to ourselves, okay, we got to do this by March 15th, so I'm going to do it on March 10th, because if I could have done it in January, but then that's 3 or 4 more months of just poisoning a well and building it's horrible. Whereas in other fields, sorry.
And why I chose to not renew this individual was they were not able to build relationships with Black girls. And I'm like, I can't. Like, in order to work at this school, and the school that I was at was 80% students of color, you have to be able to build relationships with any student that's in your class. And I remember the staff grieving it. A staff member came to me and was like, I just feel like there's been a death. And it was around this non-renewal. And I 100% believe I made the right decision for kids. But man, like what you just described, how it ripples through the staff, that's real.
Yeah, they begin to recruit parents to come to board meetings and talk to board members. And board members, if they are not clear on their roles and responsibilities, are starting to show up to ask you questions. Yeah, many of us probably have lived that.
And I want to say one more thing. That is one way that we are so fortunate in Roseville Area Schools. We have a board that is phenomenal. I remember going to the board as like a first-year principal saying, hey, I'm going to do some work around equity. Like it might cause some feelings or some things that ripple in the community. And her response was, Melissa, it's not that we'd be concerned that you're doing this work. We'd be concerned if you weren't. Wow.
It speaks a lot to the fact that you went and talked to them as well, because then they're not hearing it from someone else. So I think that there's this level of communication and this reciprocal sort of understanding of one's purpose. And so I think that's fantastic. Okay, so we've talked about what frustrated you. What could you have done differently?
This is something I've reflected on a lot. And I think one, differentiating support for all principals. Two, I think additional supports like as options for BIPOC leaders. So they have a choice. So for example, I could offer weekly check-ins. Some might say, yeah, absolutely. Some might say no, but giving them the choice. I think three, providing more supports for BIPOC leaders from BIPOC leaders. I think also creating more opportunities for affinity and being sure that we offer exit interviews.
In the end, what was something that was good that came out of the situation?
I think continuing to support BIPOC leaders as we recruit, hire, and retain, but more importantly, and you alluded to this earlier, focusing on creating a more inclusive culture rather than more support and resilience for BIPOC leaders. I also think every leader should have an equity coach. I've worked with Jamie Almanzán for years, and I think part of why I say that is sometimes being a human is complicated. I think sometimes our beliefs and behaviors and ways of being get in the way. So I think we have to work with an equity coach, someone we can be really vulnerable with, who can ask us those hard questions. Like right now, I'm working with a principal around our individual growth and development plan. And part of it is distributed leadership and delegation. And I need to first unpack her beliefs and behaviors of way of being, and then talk about systems and structures. If I go to the systems and structures, I'm going to lose her because the story she's telling herself. And I think I want to end by this. I'm going to share two quotes from our principals that I connected with. Principal one said, what was good that came out of this situation? He said, for me, the biggest thing that came out was the support and the allocation of the AP position. But he said, I also noticed a difference in how district admin connected with me afterwards in a very positive way. I was able to voice my concerns to the associate superintendent and the superintendent. They listened, they checked in, they were intentional. They asked questions like, how did this feel for you? He goes on to say, I feel safe and comfortable to continue to advocate knowing that my immediate supervisors and other cabinet members have my back and are willing to listen to the complexities that I, as a Latino man, bring to this position. Principal 2 says, so much good. I am ever becoming the leader I am. So while it was racially one of the hardest places to lead, I have a deep love for what was experienced with families, students, supervisors, and direct principal colleagues. To work for 2 female ASUPs who had reputations for leading equity work and systems improvement, what I came for, it was positive throughout. I had exposure and partnership with some of the best leaders I know, and experience in a district that is leading the state in some curricular efforts, safety efforts, and considerations for principals. So I think there is good that came from it.
Those are both beautiful and just a part of your legacy. Our guest today was Melissa Sonnek, the Associate Superintendent of the Roseville Area School District. Melissa, before I came to the Pacific Northwest, I was in Missouri, but before Missouri, I was in Oakland, California, and there were you talked about smog earlier, and it made me think about as you're going through the tunnel towards San Francisco, there would always be these smog alerts that would tell you what level we were at, and then there would be like a call to action. We're at level 5, you want to be at a level 2, then take public transit kind of thing. And it just resonated in my mind as you were talking, because I thought to myself, what Roseville seems to be in terms of your leadership and your superintendent's leadership and the leadership of your board is really bringing that down so that we actually have air that we can all breathe and think really carefully about how we support not just some, but all people, particularly your BIPOC leaders. So really grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I love that analogy around smog. I'm going to use that.
What a great episode. And so now it's time to bring back Jamie, have a conversation about my conversation with Melissa Sonnek. I feel like we need to have a sound of like the phone ringing, like ba-ring, ba-ring. All right. Hey, Jamie, what are some of your thoughts? But seriously, what are your thoughts?
Melissa's story is powerful, very powerful, about being a teen mom. And the reflection from her counselor was like, oh, damn. Oh, my goodness. Amazing that she is who she is and, all of that. And it had me reflect on a bigger question related to the people that listen and to you and me. And that was, who changed or impacted your trajectory? Because this counselor really impacted her trajectory. It was like, I'm going to go to college. And then when she had kids, the counselors questioned it and she just said, I'm doubling down.
Yeah.
I'm doubling down.
I would say my father grew up in a fairly chaotic home and no one was telling him he could do it. And he went to a semester of college at Queens College. He went to a semester college at Hofstra and then said, I'm paying for this and I don't know what I'm getting. And had some his own sort of self-direction. And of course, when he met my mother, had access to an incredible network and a book of business that allowed him to leverage his intelligence, his drive to be successful. And I think he wanted his sons, who I guess second generation? My father's first generation, that education was everything and that we would have the opportunities that he didn't have. And so I look at my brothers and myself, and so part of it is motivation, and we were inspired. Part of it is fear. I mean, do you know how hard we worked to get here? I mean, I imagine you have a similar, without speaking for you, we worked so hard for you not to fuck it up. And I think second generation gets that. You can read Guadalupe Valdez's work. You can have our own experiences. Yeah. Third generation, it's like, it's too far away for them to fully understand who, unless it's part of the family narrative, that is, constantly repeated and understood. I don't know if my children fully get it.
We've talked about this. I love this story. I love this approach. This is we are very similar in this way, in that the thing that I'm most impressed by with our eldest, Joaquin, is he truly believed he could go to any college he wanted to. In his brain, he's like, and every college, a different major. Like, I don't know, this or that. I'll study this or that, or this or this.
Amazing.
His brain is so confident and open to more things than I ever have been.
I think, though, that part of that is, again, if you are first generation, second generation, I remember saying to my father, I think I'm going to be a classics major. And he said, no, you're not.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what? No. I mean, I want you to go to college, not for that,
Mine was my uncle, Martin, who I think I've told you. I don't remember if I've told you this story or not, but I was going to be a firefighter. That's what I thought I was going to do after college.
Yes.
Or after high school.
Said, you can be a lawyer or an accountant.
Yeah. He's like, these are what's best for the family.
Right. I know. I love that story. I love that story.
This is my favorite.
And the fact that whenever you see him, he's still like, hey.
It's like, we're proud of you, but what do you do?
Yeah. Yeah.
The reasonings for the ones, what were they? They were like, I said, a doctor, we could use a doctor. The family could use a doctor. We're getting older. The family could use a lawyer. Your generation is trouble.
That's great. That's great. I love that.
Your generation is trouble. And then he said, and an accountant, because we need someone who can handle this money because we're not doing a good job. But it was all we. It was all centered on the collective identity part. And my son has a different sense of that. It's not that he's not thinking about the we, but he definitely has more freedom to explore what it is that excites him and interests him. And it felt like a form of rebellion to do it for me.
Yes.
So I was so connected with her on that story.
I really like that. Unfortunately, we've got to go. I know there's so much more we want to talk about. Maybe we'll have to release a separate conversation, because I know that there's so much more to sort of unpack. Jamie, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast.